the need for a divine source. An extract from the book Miracles, written by C.S. Lewis. Welcome. Some people regard logical thinking as the deadest and driest of our activities, and may therefore be repelled by the privileged position I gave it in the last chapter. But logical thinking, reasoning, had to be the pivot of the argument because, of all the claims which the human mind puts forward, the claim of reasoning to be valid is the only one which the naturalist cannot deny without, philosophically speaking, cutting his own throat. You cannot, as we saw, prove that there are no proofs. But you can, if you wish, regard all human ideals as illusions and all human loves as biological byproducts. That is, you can do so without running into flat self-contradiction and nonsense. Whether you can do so without extreme unplausibility, without accepting a picture of things which no one really believes, is another matter. Besides reasoning about matters of fact, men also make moral judgments. I ought to do this, I ought not to do that, this is good, that is evil. Two views have been held about moral judgments. Some people think that when we make them, we are not using our reason, but are employing some different power. Other people think that we make them by our reason. I myself hold this second view. That is, I believe that the primary moral principles on which all others depend are rationally perceived. We just see that there is no reason why my neighbor's happiness should be sacrificed to my own, as we just see that things which are equal to the same thing are equal to one another. If we cannot prove either axiom, that is not because they are irrational, but because they are self-evident and all proofs depend on them. Their intrinsic reasonableness shines by its own light. It is because all morality is based on such self-evident principles that we say to a man when we would recall him to right conduct, be reasonable. But this is by the way. For our present purpose, it does not matter which of these two views you adopt. The important point is to notice that moral judgments raise the same sort of difficulty for naturalism as any other thoughts. We always assume in discussions about morality, as in all other discussions, that the other man's views are worthless if they can be fully accounted for by some non-moral and non-rational cause. When two men differ about good and evil, we soon hear this principle being brought into play. He believes in the sanctity of property because he's a millionaire. He believes in pacifism because he's a coward. He approves of corporal punishment because he's a sadist. Such taunts may often be untrue, but the mere fact that they are made by the one side and hotly rebutted by the other shows clearly what principle is being used. Neither side doubts that if they were true, they would be decisive. No one, in real life, pays attention to any moral judgment which can be shown to spring from non-moral and non-rational causes. The Freudian and the Marxist attack traditional morality precisely on this ground, and with wide success. All men accept the principle, but of course, what discredits particular moral judgments must equally discredit moral judgment as a whole. If the fact that men have such ideas as ought and ought not at all can be fully explained by irrational and non-moral causes, then those ideas are an illusion. The naturalist is ready to explain how the illusion arose. Chemical conditions produce life. Life, under the influence of natural selection, produces consciousness. Conscious organisms which behave in one way live longer than those which behave in another. Living longer, they are more likely to have offspring. Inheritance, and sometimes teaching as well, pass on their mode of behavior to their young. Thus, in every species, a pattern of behavior is built up. In the human species, conscious teaching plays a larger part in building it up, and the tribe further strengthens it by killing individuals who don't conform. They also invent gods who are said to punish departures from it. Thus, in time, there comes to exist a strong human impulse to conform. But since this impulse is often at variance with the other impulses, a mental conflict arises, and the man expresses it by saying, I want to do A, but I ought to do B. This account may or may not explain why men do in fact make moral judgments. It does not explain how they could be right in making them. It excludes, indeed, the very possibility of their being right. For when men say I ought, they certainly think they are saying something and something true about the nature of the proposed action, and not merely about their own feelings. But if naturalism is true, I ought is the same sort of statement as I itch or I'm going to be sick. In real life, when a man says I ought, we may reply, yes. You're right. That is what you ought to do, or else, no. I think you're mistaken. But in a world of naturalists, if naturalists really remembered their philosophy out of school, the only sensible reply would be, oh, are you? All moral judgments would be statements about the speaker's feelings, mistaken by him for statements about something else, the real moral quality of actions, which does not exist. Such a doctrine, I have admitted, is not flatly self-contradictory. The naturalist can, if he chooses, brazen it out. He can say, yes, I quite agree that there is no such thing as wrong and right. I admit that no moral judgment can be true or correct, and, consequently, that no one system of morality can be better or worse than another. All ideas of good and evil are hallucinations, shadows cast on the outer world by the impulses which we have been conditioned to feel. Indeed, many naturalists are delighted to say this. But then they must stick to it, and fortunately, though inconsistently, most real naturalists do not. A moment after they have admitted that good and evil are illusions, you will find them exhorting us to work for posterity, to educate, revolutionize, liquidate, live, and die for the good of the human race. A naturalist like Mr. H.G. Wells spent a long life doing so with passionate eloquence and zeal. But surely this is very odd. Just as all the books about spiral nebulae, atoms, and cavemen would really have led you to suppose that the naturalists claim to be able to know something, so all the books in which naturalists tell us what we ought to do would really make you believe that they thought some ideas of good, their own, for example, to be somehow preferable to others. For they write with indignation, like men proclaiming what is good in itself and denouncing what is evil in itself, and not at all like men recording that they personally like mild beer, but some people prefer bitter. Yet if the oughts of Mr. Wells and, say, Franco are both equally the impulses which nature has conditioned each to have, and both tell us nothing about any objective right or wrong, whence is all the fervor? Do they remember, while they are writing, thus that when they tell us we ought to make a better world, the words ought and better must, on their own showing, refer to an irrationally conditioned impulse, which cannot be true or false, any more than a vomit or a yawn? My idea is that sometimes they do forget. That is their glory. Holding a philosophy which excludes humanity, they yet remain human. At the sight of injustice, they throw all their naturalism to the winds and speak like men and like men of genius. They know far better than they think they know. But at other times, I suspect they are trusting in a supposed way of escape from their difficulty. It works, or seems to work, like this. They say to themselves, ah yes, morality, or bourgeois morality, or conventional morality, or traditional morality, or some such addition. Morality is an illusion, but we have found out what modes of behavior will in fact preserve the human race alive. That is the behavior we are pressing you to adopt. Pray don't mistake us for moralists. We are under an entirely new management, just as if this would help. It would help only if we grant, firstly, that life is better than death, and secondly, that we ought to care for the lives of our descendants as much as, or more than, for our own. And both these are moral judgments which have, like all others, been explained away by naturalism. Of course, having been conditioned by nature in a certain way, we do feel thus about life and about posterity. But the naturalists have cured us of mistaking these feelings for insights into what we once called real value. Now that I know that my impulse to serve posterity is just the same kind of thing as my fondness for cheese, now that its transcendental pretensions have been exposed for a sham, do you think I shall pay much attention to it? When it happens to be strong, and it has grown considerably weaker since you explained to me its real nature, I suppose I shall obey it. When it is weak, I shall put my money into cheese. There can be no reason for trying to whip up and encourage the one impulse rather than the other. Not now that I know what they both are. The naturalists must not destroy all my reverence for conscience on Monday and expect to find me still venerating it on Tuesday. There is no escape along those lines. If we are to continue to make moral judgments, and whatever we say we shall in fact continue, then we must believe that the conscience of man is not a product of nature. It can be valid only if it is an offshoot of some absolute moral wisdom, a moral wisdom which exists absolutely on its own and is not a product of non-moral, non-rational nature. As the argument of the last chapter led us to acknowledge a supernatural source for rational thought, so the argument of this leads us to acknowledge a supernatural source for our ideas of good and evil. In other words, we now know something more about God. If you hold that moral judgment is a different thing from reasoning, you will express this new knowledge by saying, we now know that God has at least one other attribute than rationality. If, like me, you hold that moral judgment is a kind of reasoning, then you will say, we now know more about the divine reason. And with this, we are almost ready to begin our main argument. But before doing so, it will be well to pause for the consideration of some misgivings or misunderstandings which may have already arisen.